Survival Guide, and Camille Wimbish is going to be walking us through how we're going to get through this election season. And so with that, I'm just going to hand it over to Camille. She is the Election Administration Director for Ohio Voice. And for many years, the two of us have worked on election protection and paid attention to all the different rules that make it easier or more difficult to vote. And so now, Camille, I'm going to hand it off to you. And thank you all for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Catherine, for the introduction. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I just wanted to go through some of what we were thinking would happen or on election night, as well as give some voters some resources so they understand exactly what they need to do to make sure that their ballot is counted. So we're just going to walk through some of those right now. So we'll go through an overview of this election, what we're thinking in terms of the landscape. We'll be breaking it down by the 3 ways of voting, whether it's voting by mail, early in-person voting, or election day voting. We have a little section about counting ballots and what we can expect on election night and beyond, as well as a section about how folks may want to plug in to help others vote. And lastly, we'll round out with election protection and give folks an opportunity to ask questions. All right, so here we are. It's almost November 2020. Here we are. I think it's like 55 days until the election. And, you know, this year is obviously very unlike any other major election year. We are dealing with a pandemic, and that means it impacts all of our lives, whether it's, you know, schooling or healthcare issues, but it's definitely going to have an impact on our election. And right now, I think the biggest concern is that there could be a poll worker shortage. Ohio needs approximately 35,000 poll workers to run a presidential election. And of course, it has to be balanced between Democrats and Republicans. So it means there needs to be some increased outreach in order to make sure that we have a batch of poll workers who are not going to be at high risk for developing COVID. So that means looking to have, you know, perhaps younger folks, college students, even high school students, employed, as well as, you know, businesses stepping up, and all a host of others who are community folks who are interested in helping to make sure we have an election day like that we've been accustomed to, that folks can go to their polls in the neighborhoods and be able to cast their ballot. That is certainly our goal. And so if we're going to achieve that, we're going to have to step it up and get folks to really do their civic duty and pitch in this year as poll workers. We also know that there is increased stress on mail-in voting. You know, this primary was certainly a preview to that when we had to hastily switch from our planned election day experience to an all vote by mail primary, extended primary. And so there's lots of folks who are going to be voting by mail for the first time. And that could also mean that there's more confusion about how to do that. We've heard, of course, about the US postal system. They're also struggling with the impact of COVID, as well as some of the defunding and shenanigans that have been happening with the postal office. So that could mean that we just have to make sure that the post office is ready and that we are planning to include thoughts about making sure we give ourselves plenty of time to get those ballots in. As I said, again, voters are trying to figure out how to navigate the rules, the dates, the locations for how we're going to vote this year. And we have to be a little nimble and expect that there could be some changes. Maybe we don't get enough poll workers in certain locations. That could mean that certain polling locations will have to close. That's not what they're trying to do, but you know, we have to be nimble and understand that things could change on short notice, and we've got to be able to notify folks about those changes, as well as continuing concerns about just making sure that locations have enough you know, gloves and sanitizing equipment and masks so that everyone is safe to vote on election day. So in terms of advocacy, you know, the Ohio Voter Rights Coalition, Common Cause, the League of Women Voters, ACLU, a number of really great community partners have been, you know, trying to get the legislature to make some changes, some urgent improvements so that folks were not struggling with voting during the pandemic. Unfortunately, the legislature decided not to listen to us. They did not approve any legislative changes to how we will vote this year. So I suppose the silver lining in that is that the same rules in which we voted in 2016 and 2018, they will apply for this year. Now, the Secretary of State is looking to try to get prepaid postage on absentee ballots. He is trying to seek permission from the controlling board on Monday. Actually, there's a vote scheduled to see if we can get prepaid postage. That's certainly something that we really want to make sure that voters have access to postage. Additionally, we were trying to get additional drop boxes in each county so that voters would be able to go to the Board of Elections and even in some other neighborhood spots where it'd be convenient and place their ballot in a secure drop box. And right now, the status is that the Secretary of State has said each county is entitled to have only one drop box at the County Board of Elections. That is a matter of litigation. We're trying to make sure that we could get additional drop boxes if counties would like them. But right now that is still in limbo, as well as questions around absentee ballot matching, ability to request absentee ballots by email. Those are still some things that are pending in litigation, so we should hear something soon. But for the meantime, we just know that the rules that apply are still, that in previous years are still in place this year. And the Postal Service has given assurances that they will continue to prioritize election mail, that it is the #1 priority. And so they've said that they're going to pause the changes and continue to prioritize election mail. So that is the latest in terms of advocacy. I want to give you guys a little preview to what are some magical dates on the calendar this year. September 1st, right around Labor Day, is when absentee ballot applications or vote by mail applications, those were mailed to registered voters. So if for some reason you did not receive an application in the mail, that should be a signal to you to check your voter registration and make sure that the Secretary of State has your most up-to-date address so that you can receive your absentee ballot application. October 5th, coming up next month, will be the deadline to register to vote. So folks who have moved from another state, or if they wanted to just update their registration if they moved within the state, the deadline to do that is October 5th. October 6th is the date that we start early voting. So that means absentee ballots will be mailed by the boards of elections beginning that day, and there will be in-person voting opportunities as well. And then, of course, the big shebang is November 3rd, Election Day. All right, so now we're going to go over the 3 ways that folks can vote this year. And certainly we want to encourage folks to vote in person and at the early vote center, or to vote by mail. Those are really great options so that you're not worried about something coming up, something unexpected coming up on Election Day. You can make sure that you have a plan to vote early. All right, so first up, absentee voting or voting by mail. So the first thing to know about voting by mail is that you need to fill out a paper application. Ohio is a state that you have to apply to vote by mail. A ballot is not automatically sent to you. Even if you call the Board of Elections and tell them you want to vote by mail, they will mail you an application first. You may not, unfortunately, submit your request online or email them. They will send you a paper form that you will have to sign and date and provide your ID so that they will know to issue you a ballot. So we were certainly encouraging folks to fill those out over the summer, and the absentee ballot applications, as I said, hit folks' mailboxes just a while ago. And so if folks didn't have access to printers, the nice thing that is different over the primary is that voters actually received the ballots in the mail. Just a note there that You may have received an absentee ballot request from another organization, or perhaps you just went online to voteohio.gov and filled one out yourself. And then you're thinking, well, why did I get another application? I already submitted one. If you've already submitted one, you do not need to submit another one. There's no need for duplicate requests. It's not a mistake. You can, if you're feeling like you want assurances, by all means, go to voteohio.gov, track your ballot, make sure that the board has received your application. You can also call the Board of Elections and confirm that they have your application. And worst case, you could fill out a duplicate application, and there's nothing wrong with that. The board is not going to penalize you, or you're not going to get in trouble if you inadvertently submit two applications. One thing I would like to warn folks about is that when you do fill out the application, that means you are committing to vote by mail, and that it's not your intention to vote on election day. So this should be something that folks do with, the utmost deliberation and understanding that that is your plan to vote for November, is to vote by mail. So the key to, if you're voting by mail, is not to wait. We like to think about how we have this long, wonderful, generous early voting period. We have around 30 days, 29 days to cast a ballot. But we don't want to procrastinate. This is not the year to sit and procrastinate. We don't want to let the ballot collect dust on your table, because there are mail delays expected. The Postal Service is warning folks it could take 10 days or more for the ballots to make their way through the mail. And we also want to give folks enough time that if there is a mistake that folks make on their application or their ballot, that there's plenty of time to correct that and still get it through the mail system. So we have been saying for folks, all through the summer and even now, go ahead and apply as soon as you get that application. Don't wait. Make sure you get it done today. So this is a slide that I created, sort of a timeline, just to show folks that there's really no room to procrastinate this year. As I said, applications should be going in as you receive them. And let's say you submitted them, and maybe over the summer, or maybe you got one last week and you popped it in the mailbox. The boards of elections will begin mailing those ballots on October 6th. That's the first date they are allowed to mail them by law. And assuming that this takes around 5 days for the mail to make its way to you, the ballot gets to you around October 11th. Then you take a few days, you research the candidate, you find a stamp, it gets back into the mail. And then by October 19th, the ballot is received by the Board of Elections, but they're reviewing it and they discover, oops, you forgot to sign it, and they must mail it back to you. So that's another 5 days. It's October 26th when you receive a notice saying, oh, there's something wrong, you need to correct it. You correct it right away and put it back in the mail. Well, don't you know, they have just received your ballot the day before Election Day, which is fine. It's in green, it's going to count, but that's just to show you that there's not as much time as you might imagine with 29 days of early voting if there is a mistake. So make sure you're building enough time. And this slide is basically the same concept, except that we're saying perhaps it takes 7 days, because remember the USPS said it could take 10 days. So if you assume that the mail takes 7 days to go back and forth, and you assume that, oops, you made a simple mistake that needs to be corrected, it could be the day before the very, very last day that absentee ballots could be accepted. The election day is November 3rd, but boards of elections have a cure period. So November 13th would be the very last day. It would be after the election. You would just barely squeak it in to make sure that your ballot counts. So this is really just to say, please don't wait. So our suggestion is make sure that you are tracking your ballot. You can track your request. You can track your ballot. So if you're voting by mail, just make sure that you understand where your ballot is in the process. You can go to voteohio.gov to track your ballot, or if you don't want to go online, you can call the Board of Elections and ask them to give you an update on where your application and ballot are. All right, a few do's and don'ts. Make sure that you provide correct postage, assuming that postage is not provided. Perhaps it will be, but right now, postage is not provided. So assume that your ballot is going to require more than one stamp. In your absentee ballot, you'll receive some instructions from the Board of Elections that should indicate exactly what the postage required would be. So check those instructions. Make sure you seal your ballot inside the ID envelope. Do not put more than one ballot in the envelope. So let's say you get a ballot and your spouse gets a ballot and you want to save a stamp and you just stick them both in the same envelope. Don't do that. That is not good. Don't detach the stubs. Don't do anything to alter your ballot. If you do make a mistake, you can request an alternate, basically a replacement ballot. But if that happens, of course, contact the board as soon as possible so they can reissue one so that you're not running up against the deadline. If you get a ballot and you realize, oh, I missed the voter registration deadline, let me just try to use this absentee ballot to update my registration, that won't work either. That's not a shortcut around updating your voter registration. But you can, if needed, provide an alternate mailing address. So let's say you were planning to you have a registered address, but for the time being, you're staying with your aunt and uncle. You could provide your aunt and uncle's address if that's where you expect to be to complete your absentee ballot temporarily. So there will be a space for that. So the legal deadline to request an absentee ballot is October 31st. But to be honest, there's really no expectation that the Board of Elections will be able to get it back to you in time, particularly with the slowdown in the mail system. So we're really encouraging people to apply as soon as possible if that's how you want to vote. Again, the ballots are going to start getting mailed out October 6th. Check the Board of Elections, check the ballot tracker. If something happens to your ballot, call and they can reissue you one. In terms of returning your ballot, those ballots have to be postmarked the Monday before Election Day. So you want to make sure that you get to the post office and have them actually hand cancel and provide that postmark so you know that it is going to get that official postmark and be counted by the boards of elections. If you're not comfortable putting it in the mail, the other option is that you could bring it back to the Board of Elections and drop it in the drop box. You have until Election Day, close of poll 7:30, if you want to return your ballot that way. So this is just a slide that I created. You may have seen or received a mailing this summer with a absentee ballot application. It's not a fraudulent thing that was happening. It wasn't some suspicious thing. The Secretary of State has, said this is a great thing, and they actually did provide postage. So again, it's just a reminder that multiple applications could have gone out, and just track your ballot. If you've already filled one out, you don't need to fill out duplicate ones. And then lastly, a thing about security. I know there's been lots of talk about absentee ballot security or vote by mail fraud. It's important to know that Ohioans have been voting safely and securely with no fault absentees since 2006. So ballots are not going out to all voters. Some states are actually sending ballots to everyone who's on the rolls. Again, Ohio says you have to apply for your ballot. And there are additional security safeguards built in that you have to provide your date of birth, your social security number, your state ID number, and sign it and have that signature match the database to receive your ballot. And then lastly, everything that is done at the Board of Elections is done with bipartisan teams. They consider themselves this Noah's Ark, 2 by 2. You have to have a Democrat and a Republican handling all the ballots, assisting voters with voting, If you want to open the doors to, secure ballots, you have to have there's a separate Democratic key and a Republican key. So it's really a team effort, and there are lots of security guards and security protocols in place to ensure that there's no shenanigans happening at the Board of Elections. All right, so now we're up to early in-person voting. This is a pretty short and simple option, but it's a really good one. This is actually my personal favorite way of voting. Again, you have one early voting location in each county. It's probably at your Board of Elections. There's 2 counties where they have separate early vote centers from their Board of Elections, Lucas County and Summit County. I believe one of them, they're very close to one another, but just double check the address if you're in either one of those counties before you go there, because you want to make sure you get to the right location to vote. If you would like to early vote in person, it's just at the Board of Elections. You cannot go to your neighborhood polling place. So that is something to know. And evening and weekend hours are going to be available this cycle. Look for them, especially the last 2 weeks before Election Day. And one of the other great reasons why early in-person voting is so great is because you really don't need to worry about ID. You simply can be asked to provide the last 4 digits of your Social Security number or to provide your driver's license number. So for certain populations, let's say you're worrying about having a driver's license or a utility bill in your name, you can go to the early vote center and just give them the last 4 digits and you're good to go. These are the hours that are listed for Franklin County Board of Elections for early voting. However, each county Board of Elections has the same days and hours of voting. It's a uniform schedule, so it works for the whole state. And just note that, again, looking towards, especially towards the last 2 weeks when people are really focused on voting, there are hours like 8 to 7 starting October 26th, as well as the last 2 Saturdays and 2 Sundays for voting. So there's really plenty of opportunity for folks who want to utilize that method. All right, so here we are, Election Day voting. You may be thinking, yeah, I like the tradition of going to the polls. Well, this is for you. Polls are going to be open from 6:30 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. And if you are in line by 7:30 p.m., you must be permitted to vote. Just make sure you're going to the precinct where you currently reside. So that means if you've moved and you didn't update your registration, don't try to think you're going to pull one over to the Board of Elections and think no one will know or be able to catch you. They probably will know and they probably will catch you. It is illegal. You must vote where you're currently living. So find your new polling location for your current address, and that's where you go vote. And you can find your polling locations at voteohio.gov or call 866-OUR-VOTE. So again, this year in particular, we're really encouraging people who want to vote on Election Day to check their polling location and even check it, the day that you plan to go vote. Just because of poll worker shortages and the likelihood of consolidated polling places, it could mean that your polling location where you voted the last time is not the polling location where you would vote this time. I know boards of elections have had to change locations that, if they were in a senior center or a nursing home, they've closed those locations to protect those populations. And certainly there could be many other locations who've decided they no longer wish to be polling places. And so there's lots of shuffling happening. Boards of elections are doing their best to nail down those locations, but they may change on a dime. So please verify your polling location and to ensure that your vote's going to be counted. Voteohio.gov, 866-OUR-VOTE. Those are 2 places to find polling place info. So Election Day ID is a little different. If you recall when I said when you're voting by mail or you're voting early in person, you're just writing the last 4 digits of your social security number. But on election day ID, there's actually a different standard, different IDs that are required. You must provide an Ohio driver's license or state ID. That's one of the acceptable options. Now, I will note here, the address does not have to match your registration. So let's say, you know, you moved, but your driver's license does not reflect that new address. That's okay, as long as it's a valid driver's license. The poll workers are trained to accept that ID. Now, there is one little asterisk this year, is that, you know, because of COVID, the BMVs have been sort of closed. They have been encouraging folks to delay coming in. And they've said that the Secretary of State has said that if your ID has recently expired due to COVID and you've not gone into the BMV to renew your driver's license, that driver's license will still be accepted on election day. But it might also be a good idea to also bring a backup ID that can include a government ID or a utility bill, perhaps a cell phone bill, a bank statement, a pay stub, any document like that that has your name, address, and it's been issued in the last 12 months. Any copies of those, like physical paper copies of those, are really good forms of ID that should be accepted on election day. There are some IDs that people think should be ID, but they're not actually accepted IDs. So you cannot vote on election day with your student ID, unfortunately. You cannot vote with a passport, and you can't even vote with that postcard that the Board of Elections mails to you to confirm your polling address or your voter registration. Again, it has to be like the driver's license or utility bill if you're voting on election day. Now, some of you may be wondering about provisional ballots. They are ballots that are a last resort. They can be voted with the last 4 digits of your social security number. Basically, it just means that there's something about your eligibility that's in question. So that could mean maybe you didn't update your registration, or perhaps you requested an absentee ballot and they want to confirm that you're not going to attempt to double vote. So they're going to hold that ballot and do some further investigation to confirm your eligibility before it's counted. So that means a provisional ballot is not going to be included in those election night totals. We remind folks that every voter is entitled to vote a provisional ballot. So no one should be turned away at the polls on election day. But the key to that provisional ballot is just that you have to be at the correct polling location. And you should also try to see if you need to do any additional follow-up information. So for instance, if you filled out your provisional ballot and you forgot to sign it, or maybe provide the last 4 of your social security number, you may want to just double check that there's anything else the Board of Elections may need to confirm your eligibility within 7 days. All right, so perhaps you've heard about purge voters, voters who've been removed from the rolls. So there's some good news here. Voters who were purged between 2011 and 2019 because they were not voting frequently enough, those voters can still cast a provisional ballot and have that counted if they live in the same county as their purge registration. So the key there is you have to go to the precinct where you currently reside in order for that provisional ballot to be counted. But right now we still have plenty of time for folks to update their registration. So we want to encourage everyone to confirm their registration and update it if needed. But as a last resort, if someone has been purged from the rolls, they can cast a provisional ballot that should be counted as long as they're in the right precinct. Okay, rounding out the ballot counting section. Here we go. So lots of folks are accustomed to, election night and going to bed and knowing who is the new president or You know, perhaps like if a levy has won, this year we have to be kind of patient and understand that it could be more difficult to project winners on election night because more folks are going to be voting by mail than usual. And that means ballots can continue to roll into the Board of Elections well after election night. And so the margin could be so small that they're not actually able to project the winner. Absentee ballots, or the ballots that are cast by mail or early in person, those are the first ballots that end up getting counted on election night. So when the polls close and it's 7:45, 8 o'clock, and you start seeing numbers rolling in, those first ballots and votes are from the absentee totals. And that's because the boards of elections, as they receive the applications, or as they receive the ballots, they're able to process them and validate them ballots as they come in. They're not tabulating anything until the polls are closed, but they are processing those ballots. And so that gives folks a little bit of a head start on knowing where vote totals are coming from. So the results that come in on election night, those are unofficial results, but it's actually 21 days after election day before there are official results. They're still reviewing provisional ballots, and they're still receiving absentee ballots. And so I just like to warn folks that just because you may not have a result, you may not have winners by election night, it doesn't mean that there's any sort of funny business necessarily happening. It's just that there's just more folks voting by mail than ever before. And that could mean that there's more unaccounted ballots that are not yet in the hands of the boards of elections. So, as I said, in terms of counting ballots, absentee ballots have to be postmarked no later than the day before election day and received at the Board of Elections office no later than the 10th day after election day. If the absentee ballot does not have a postmark, it can come into their office. You can turn it in the drop box. They'll take ballots as long as they get there by 7:30 on election night, and those are definitely counted and accepted. Folks may have questions about, like, what about returning them in person? What do I need to know? You can return it in person at the drop box. You can have a family member put your ballot in the drop box at the Board of Elections. It has to be a close family member in terms of who can do the returning. It can't just be like a neighbor or an employee or something like that. It should be a close family member. And again, do not return those ballots to the precinct or polling location. You have to take them all the way to the Board of Elections. So there's a 7-day cure period if there is a mistake. So if folks forget to print their name, because there's a requirement that voters print their name, there's a requirement that they sign their name, and there's a requirement that you write your ID. If any of those are missing, the Board of Elections must reject that ballot and send a deficiency letter so that voters have an opportunity to fix that mistake. There's 7 days 7 days after election day to do that, as well as 7 days to fix a provisional ballot with additional information. And then starting the 11th day is when the boards of elections are actually doing their official canvass to make sure that they have all of the ballots in and counted to give us an official result on the 21st day after the election. So again, be patient, folks. Okay, so if there are some rules around helping others to vote, I know lots of folks have been asking about postage. Can community groups provide postage if the Secretary of State doesn't get the approval to prepay postage? Could groups, sponsor people to have postage? This is really an open question of law. The Voter Information Center, they did provide postage paid envelopes, and the Secretary of State sort of gave his thumbs up to that mailing. So, so that's a good sign. But one thing you for sure can do is you can take in others if they're absentee ballot request forms. So you can collect, let's say, your neighbors or folks you go to church with. You can collect other people's absentee ballot request forms and take those into the Board of Elections. But they only want immediate family members handling ballots because, of course, ballots are a sort of a sacrosanct thing that we don't want anyone to have any appearance of tampering with. So you want to be super careful about handling ballots and only allow immediate family to do that. And if you're so inclined to offer folks a ride to the polls or a ride to the early vote center, you can absolutely do that. One misconception I want to point out is a lot of people think, oh, if someone has a criminal background, they're not allowed to vote. In Ohio, we have some really good laws around that. And we allow anyone who is not currently incarcerated for a felony to be able to vote. So that could mean you have a misdemeanor, or perhaps you've completed probation or parole. You're allowed to re-register. You still have the right to vote, but you got to make sure that your registration is up to date, and then you can exercise your civic duties. So that's really good news for folks who are in Ohio. If you're in another state, you just want to make sure you're checking your state rules around the restoration of felony convictions. Okay, so we're rounding out, getting close to the end here. Election protection. This is a program that is near and dear to my heart. We are providing nonpartisan voter resources. It's a hotline for information, for checking registration, checking your polling location, letting voters know about their rights, and has a process to document and resolve any problems that crop up. So there's an English language hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE. There's the Spanish language hotline, 888-VEYVOTA, and the Chinese language, and I believe there's some other Asian languages supported at 888-API-VOTE. So this hotline is something that is running year-round, and of course during election season, it's staffed with live people you can call on the phone and talk through questions that you may have. We just want to make sure that we're documenting any problems. That helps to make our elections work better in the future. It helps us advocate for improvements when we can show that there are, reported problems with specific counties, or perhaps it's voting technology, whatever the case may be. If we have a record of it, it helps us fix it. It also can help us if we need to do any type of litigation. If there are problems that we can show a pattern of, it's helped, give us arguments for improving things. It's helped in terms of extending polling locations if there are long lines that are documented. So please help us to spread the number, 866-OUR-VOTE, the English language hotline. If you're doing any type of, voter outreach, if you're talking to folks on the phones, or if you're creating voter literature, or, just texting folks about voting, please let them know to call the hotline. That can be just another resource for voters who have questions along the way. As I mentioned, all the calls.
We did get a request to go back to the previous slide, just for a minute.
This one?
Yep.
Great. Yep. So this is the numbers, and you can expect to see from us lots of social media with promoting these phone numbers to remind folks to call the hotline. We're purchasing some radio ads this year, and we partner with a number of folks who do traditional voter outreach to make sure this gets printed on door knockers and text programs and all of that. So, all right. So as I said, this is a hotline. It's run through the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. It's a national organization. They're the nation's largest election protection hotline, and they partner with groups in states all over the country, including the Ohio Voter Rights Coalition, that we've been doing this work for numbers of years. And we are logging the problems. We are following up with boards of elections when we hear of problems, and we're getting those things resolved so that voters are encountering as few barriers as possible at this fall. We expect the hours to answer the live calls between 10 and 6. And I know that they're going to be working on having extended hours so that folks can call later in the evening as well on the weekends. And if folks have legal experience or experience with answering the hotline, let us know, because we are looking to have basically a command center here in Ohio, a virtual command center where folks are monitoring the data that's coming in, the calls that are coming in, to make sure that when there are problems, not just like, where's my polling location, but someone has an issue with the boards of elections, maybe their ballot's been rejected, their application's been rejected, or they've run into some other difficulty, they can call the hotline, and then we're working to get an answer and clarification from the boards of elections so that it's not a problem for more voters. So we are going to be looking for command centers, volunteers. This is our sort of campaign page. As you'll see, there's a number of organizations who are partnering with this election protection effort. So you may be hearing from multiple groups, whether it's ACLU or All Voting is Local, Common Cause, the League, Ohio Voter Rights Coalition, and others who are all working together to make sure voters all across the state have the resources and information they need to vote. So we will be recruiting for folks aggressively to make sure that we have assistance. There's going to be a number of opportunities. Election ambassadors are folks who can help us distribute voter education, whether it's literature or poem cards or posters, absentee ballot applications, just making sure that folks know about the hotline. So if you're interested in helping to distribute literature and let people know about the do's and don'ts of voting, we'll give you a training. And for folks who are like really wanting to be super engaged and do some of these types of mini presentations about how folks can make a plan to vote and what they should expect with voting, we can train you up as an election ambassador. We are looking for poll monitors. Those are folks who will be out at the polls on election day, as well as at the early vote centers, who can assist voters with questions or problems that they may be having. We have opportunities for folks to do that as they traditionally would, only with a mask, keeping a safe distance and talking to voters and walking them through the system. We also have some, safer, less contact versions where folks will be able to monitor the polls from their cars or their bikes, and just sort of giving us reports about how the polling location is running. So if that's something that interests you, just please sign up to be a poll monitor. We have social media monitors who are going to be trained on checking, the Facebook and the Twitter and the Nextdoor and the various platforms to check for misinformation and disinformation that's out there, because we know that's going to be a real threat this year. So we'll get you trained up so you can be able to alert us to problems and as well, hit back with actual accurate information that promotes voting, promotes the hotline. So that is a really simple but effective thing that you can do to engage this year. And as I mentioned, we also have those command center volunteers, folks who are just helping to make sure that the problems on the back end get routed to the Board of Elections for resolution. And last but not least, we don't want to be remiss in encouraging folks to sign up to be poll workers if that's something that you're interested in. If you can commit to working a long full day, somewhere between 5:30 a.m. to after the close of polls on 7:30, you can be paid to work as a poll worker and know that you're really helping out our democracy by, ensuring that we have in-person voting opportunities on election day. So just keep that in mind if you've got reliable transportation and you're not someone who falls in that higher risk category. I know boards of elections would love to have you be a poll workers. I know the Secretary of State just published like a poll worker tracker thing, and it shows that there are a number of counties that still have hundreds of poll workers that they're looking for. So please sign up if that's what you're interested in. And that sort of rounds out my presentation. There are a number of places where you can go for more information, and I'm happy to take questions.
So Camille, this is Catherine. I have a few questions that I've picked up from here, and then also people have been sending things in from Facebook. The first one was a question about poll workers. They wanted to know, why don't they actually change the poll worker hours so the day isn't so long?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that's something that we've been advocating for, but what we hear when we raise it is that boards of elections are concerned about the flake rate, that if they have to recruit, let's say each county, let's say a county has to recruit 3,000 poll workers, and but then they decide they're going to split the shift. So how do they know that they won't actually need to get 4,000 or 5,000 or 6,000 poll workers, because you just don't know who's going to call off during which shift. So they just think it's an easier lift for folks to just, for them, for their recruiting purposes, to just stick with the traditional way of having folks work the poll for the full day.
So here's another question. Norbert asks, I am moving to Indiana, but I'm not sure I'm going to be there 30 days in advance to register. What do I do?
So that's a great question. What I will say is that there is a provision for folks who are not fully new state residents to still be able to vote in that state for the presidential race. So that you're not going to be excluded from voting for president. You may not be able to vote all the way down a regular ballot, but you'll still be able to vote for president in Indiana. I would just, check with the Indiana Secretary of State, or you can call 866 and someone can help walk you through that process. 866 our vote.
So now I have another one. So this is something you mentioned, but just to reaffirm this, who can actually drop off the ballots? So
boards of elections say that it should be a close family member. So think spouse, first degree relative. So mother, father, brother, sister, spouse.
Okay, so the follow-up is, how will they know?
I don't know. I'm just telling you the rules. They say that's who should drop it off. I think if you probably, no one is probably going to be checking ID at the drop box, but I would not show up with 10 ballots to try to stuff in the drop box. People are going to think that is very suspicious. So just take your immediate family members' ballots to the drop box.
Are there times that you should drop them off?
I believe the drop box is monitored with a camera, and that they are available to be accessed 24 hours a day.
All right, now I have another question, and then I'm going to let Mia ask you a few. What should I do if I can't? I know I applied to vote by mail, or I applied to do absentee voting. But I don't find, after a few days, I don't actually find it's tracking at all. What should I do?
So you can always give the Board of Elections a phone call and ask them if they've received it. It's better to call and, not let too much time get away. But I will say, like, if you requested your ballot, many months ago, I think it was not until September 1st that some county boards of elections were tracking ballots. So if you're thinking, well, I tried to track it in August and I didn't see anything, that might be why. But if you're trying to track it now and you don't see it, I would call the Board of Elections.
So I have a couple of questions that people were asking. Am I allowed to hand my ballot to my postal worker as they come around by my house?
I think that's fine. They're a postal worker. That seems like the same thing as going to the post office and giving them the ballot and having them stamp it. So Sure.
Great, thanks. Another question. Are the early votes tabulated as they are received by the Board of Elections?
So no, essentially, ballots are going to be they're going to be mailed out on October 6th. So someone could return their ballot at maybe it's October 7th. Someone takes it to the drop box and sticks it right back in. The Board of Elections is just going to open it up. They're going to check to make sure that they filled out all the ID information, their name, they printed their name where they printed, and they signed it where they're supposed to sign it, and they wrote their, date of birth, and all the information is correct and valid. And then they will probably just have it at the ready, but they're not tabulating any results. So no one has any sense of, whether one candidate is doing better than another candidate. They don't tabulate anything until after 7:30 p.m. close of polls.
What does the current president mean when he tells people to go and vote twice? If I were to go and vote twice, wouldn't the poll worker know that I had already voted in another method?
Well, that's a good question. So what happens is, let's say you, so first, let me just say, don't vote twice. That's not a good idea. It's not a good idea to try to test the system and see if they can root out fraud. We don't want anyone to do that. We should feel confident that the system does work the way it's designed to work. Now, if you request an absentee ballot and you try to go vote at the polls on election day, what should happen is that the poll book will have an A by your name for absentee ballot. And so they will have a record that you requested an absentee ballot. And if you didn't get it, or you decide you don't want to vote by mail anymore, you can bring your absentee ballot to the polls. And they will let you, they will let you fill out a provisional ballot. We would suggest is if you no longer want to vote by mail, let's say it didn't get to you, you try to track it and you're worried and you haven't received it and you're running up on the deadline, you can go to the early vote center and you can vote there in person at the early vote center and vote a regular ballot and everything will be just fine. But if you requested an absentee ballot and you wait till election day, you will be voting provisionally. And at the end of the day, the boards of elections are only counting one ballot. They're going to check to make sure that you voted once, and then anything else is not going to be counted.
Okay. Here's one more question. We do have ballot tracking in every county in Ohio. Is that something that they have in every state or only in some states?
I'm going to guess that many states do not yet have this. Each state has a whole hodgepodge of different election rules, and many states are not even as far along as Ohio in terms of really encouraging people to vote by mail. A lot of states still require people to have an excuse, and some states have even said COVID-19 is not an excuse to vote by mail. So they have really small numbers of people who are voting by mail, so they're probably not as invested in having a robust tracking system. So I think we should consider ourselves relatively lucky that we have that here in Ohio.
So I have another question. So this person heard there was going to be curbside voting and but they wondered how that might work.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm wondering how that might work myself. Essentially, curbside voting has been a thing that's existed for quite some time for folks who go to the polls and they're just not able to enter the polls. Let's say there's, the polling place is not ADA accessible, or they're not mobile and can't get out of the polls. So what traditionally would happen is the person perhaps in the car with them could go into the Board of Elections, into the polling location and say, I have a curbside voter, and two poll workers, remember I said it has to be a bipartisan team, a Democrat and Republican would come out with a ballot and actually vote them with a paper ballot, a regular paper ballot from their car. And this year, that is going to be available. I think the question is just, hopefully they'll have enough poll workers to be able to facilitate that curbside voting. There could be a great demand for curbside voting for folks who aren't comfortable going into the polling locations. And so we're trying to make sure that polling locations have, some sort of signage or system for folks being able to be alerted inside the polls to come out and provide that curbside voting. But I think really it's going to be kind of an individual polling place by polling place sort of encounter. So, be patient if you're worried about curbside voting. But again, another good option would be to go to the early vote center. And there they have lots of staff who can vote you curbside between October 6th and November 2nd.
So here's another question. What happens if the electronic poll books don't work?
Yeah, so I know that has happened in some counties in previous elections. Maybe there's like a power outage, or perhaps like in Hamilton County, there was an issue where, poll workers, there's rolling out the new machines and they just weren't comfortable and trained well on what to do. But each polling location will have a paper backup. So if the e-poll books are not working for some reason, or a poll worker doesn't know how to access it, there will be a physical directory of the full poll book, a paper poll book that will be able to be used just as an e-poll book would.
Camille,
Somebody who wanted to volunteer, I'll do this real quickly, Mia, and then I'll hand it off to you. Somebody wanted to volunteer, but just wanted to be sure that she did not need to be an attorney to volunteer for election protection.
Absolutely, great question. We don't need attorneys. I was just saying, in terms of the command center, that particular opportunity might be helpful to have a legal background or background with call centers. But if you want to be a social media monitor, an ambassador, or a poll monitor, folks from all walks of life are welcome and encouraged to volunteer.
awesome. I just wanted to, there was a question came up a second time about if you've requested an absentee ballot and you don't want to vote that way, if you can come in and kind of trade it in at early vote. And I know that Cuyahoga County, some people there were saying that that was possible, and I'd actually spoken to the Secretary of State about that, and their answer was no, you are not allowed to do that. And the reason was that when you make that absentee ballot request, you have a certain barcode that's associated with you as a voter, and if you go in and you vote on a machine, then you're going to have a second barcode, and that's going to end up being a problem. So you would be voting provisionally if you went in to vote at early vote after having requested an absentee ballot. So generally we say stick with one method or the other.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. And I think we should get some written clarification on that. But yeah, these things it's all kind of a work in progress, right?
Absolutely.
Another question, how about are masks required?
So that's a funny question. It's funny, it's not really funny. It's just that there's been kind of a murky answer on that. Essentially, the answer is yes and no. Basically, the polls are, indoor locations, so everyone is required in the state of Ohio to wear a mask indoors. But it's also that voting is a First Amendment activity, and so the Secretary has said that anyone who comes to the polls will be offered a mask, and if they refuse to wear a mask, they will be offered a safer location off to the side to vote without their mask on. Clear as mud, right?
We also had a question. This person was worried about like how many provisional ballots are rejected and wanted to know like what you can do to make sure, like if you actually have to vote a provisional ballot, what you can do so that it's not rejected.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. Ohio has had a larger number of provisional ballots in the past than many other states. We kind of have this complicated rules for voting provisional ballots, and there's lots of reasons why people can be offered provisional ballots in Ohio. But if you're concerned about a provisional ballot, you would just want to make sure that you are basically filling it out carefully. Making sure that you're printing it clearly, that you're making sure the name, the signature, date of birth, Make sure if you're moved, you want to provide a updated address so that they know where your new registration would be. And you can also provide an old address if you have, if you've moved, so that they know how to, match up those records. And then at the end of the day, before you leave, they should hand you a piece of paper with a provisional ballot hotline number on there that you can call to check to make sure that everything is good with your provisional ballot. You can also call 866-OUR-VOTE, and we can walk you through those steps. And you can call the Board of Elections after Election Day and check with them to make sure that there's nothing else that is needed for your provisional ballot. So it is sort of a, fail safe so that folks are not turned away from the polls, and that there is an opportunity for everyone to be able to cast their ballot. You just have to be diligent and do it carefully.
Well, I don't know if there are any more questions. I think the one thing that, the one that I did get had to do with what is the last day that you recommend sending your absentee ballot back? What's the very last day by mail that you should wait?
So I think it's something like October 20th-ish is really sort of the last day that we would recommend it. Just because the mail is saying that they need 10 to 15 days of leeway to be able to make sure that your ballot gets to the Board of Elections. And again, if you're worried, you could either put it in a Dropbox to drive it to the Board of Elections and put it there in the Dropbox. That will certainly save some time and delay from the mail. Or try to go vote at the early vote center. If you're still within the early vote period, because that way you know that it's a done deal.
And Anna, do you have any other questions?
Well, somebody asked, will the 866 hotline be open after Election Day for a few days?
Yes. So the hotline runs year round. And certainly this election, as I said, it's not just Ohio where we're expecting that, the projected winners could take longer. It's many other states. This is a national hotline. So we will be, keeping the hotline up for folks who need have additional questions, guidance. We expect that this could just be kind of a very unusual election. And so we're going to keep the hotlines running.
Well, Camille, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who joined us. And get out there, make sure you're registered to vote. Voteohio.gov is how you can check your voter registration. And Camille, anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so. I just, I appreciate everyone coming out tonight. I think that if you can just share this information with 5 friends, and understand that essentially we just need everyone to commit to making a plan to vote, and we can get through this together.
Track your ballot.
Everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Camille.